Dishonor, Chapter 29, 32. The feast was hardly 77 dishes and not even close what someone of Lena's station would normally warrant. She was making a show of looking happy from her position next to Ser Joffrey, but I could tell it was strained. As the dancing began, I caught her attention. "How are you faring?" I asked, dropping into Ser Joffrey's abandoned seat and making a point of being polite for Joffrey's sake. Rhaenys had requested a dance and the poor man hadn't been brave enough to refuse. From the looks on both their faces and Rhaenys' lips moving, I'd say the new Valerion was having a not-so-friendly warning about which of the siblings he was interested in betting. Lena followed my gaze and sighed. "Mother blames him, you know." I raised my eyebrow at her and she blushed, more red coming to her cheeks that were already flushed from the wine. "On the upside, she thinks you've the patience of the mother now. She thought you and Joffrey were lovers." "Oh geez, that explains a lot. Whilst I'm happy Lady Rhaenys no longer rates me as a homewrecker, I asked if you were well." She regarded me through violet eyes for a moment before a small smile crept across her face. "Homewrecker? You say such odd things sometimes, Rhaenyra." I was about to take her to task for ignoring the question again when she sighed and answered. "I am as well as can be. It's just a hard thing to swallow. I don't want this, and yet Laenor says if I do not, I risk everything." She still believed that somehow he would marry her if she just went to him. Laenor's lies may have wrestled an agreement out of her, but it was clear she found them hard to weigh against her feelings. I cursed my uncle again and forced a pleasant smile onto my face. I did not know what it would take to get her to see the truth. I'd laid out his desire for power. Laenor had speculated as to his motives for the affair. She seemed genuinely wary of him but still proclaimed to love him. "Remember, you need the dragon. Don't slap her silly, you really want her dragon." One of her drunker cousins clambered to his feet and Lena tensed. The dreaded call for the betting could come at any moment after all. I had hated my own betting, being lifted into the air and stripped by a gang of drunken, lusty men. Worse still, they hadn't exactly held back on grabbing what they could reasonably write off as an accident to their equally drunk fellows. My body had been a mess of bruises the next morning and Laenor hadn't fared much better. The women had turned out to be just as grab-happy as the men. And some of the jokes and suggestions they'd shouted. I had been much older than the 17 they thought me, and remembering some of them still made me blush. The drunken cousin merely called for another toast to the health of the newlyweds, to the immediate happiness of the hall. A few more toasts followed and I was glad for the amount of food I'd managed to choke down. Had I drunk this much on a normal meal, I'd probably be passed out in a corner right now. We settled into a companionable silence and watched the revelers party. Rhaenys eventually released Ser Joffrey, who staggered his way up to us looking as if he'd just been fighting for his life, although given the look Rhaenys shot at his back, that might not be too far off. He sat next to us and commandeered some wine, draining the mug. "I haven't asked how you're holding up," I said, feeling guilty. Laenor had been the one to lay our plan out for him and persuade him to go along with it. I had barely had time to ask him how he was doing. He was marrying Daemon's seconds, as disgusting as that concept was, claiming his bastard as his own. The fact that the marriage would not be a happy one went without saying, as Lena still looked vaguely discontent even when she was supposed to be playing the blushing bride. Well enough. I will not complain that I have been given a beautiful bride, a chance to serve the future queen and the esteem of the future prince consort. His gaze drifted to Laenor, who was entertaining some of his female cousins. "Giving up the Lonmouth name, it is a painful thing, but it is needed." "Do you intend to reconcile with Laenor?" asked Lena, leaning over me so that Joffrey could hear her lowered voice. She still felt guilty she'd outed him to her mother, I gathered. Even decked out in her wedding gown, she still smelt of dragon and the sea air. "I hope to dash." He was cut off. "The betting." Lena snapped back into her chair and shot me a terrified look as the first call went up and was echoed by most of the hall. Men and women surged forward, Laenor leading the men, shooting glares at some of the dirtier guests. Joffrey didn't look so much better. He was trying to compose his face into his default, but the trapped look in his eyes gave it away. Did anyone actually enjoy this tradition? Was it cruel to make them go through with it? I fell in beside Joffrey and helped the crowd of women lift him, paying special attention to his leg so that it did not pain him. Some of the lesser Valerians complained about how fiddly it made shucking him out of his clothes, but were hushed either by his sister or, surprisingly, Lady Rhaenys herself. Still, they managed to strip him, and both myself and Rhaenys managed to ensure he wasn't dropped on the way before he was carried inside the set of rooms he would share with Lena and dropped onto their marriage bed. He was as red as a tomato as we left, with some of our group still calling out decidedly lewd suggestions for the betting itself. We met Laner's group coming out as they delivered a naked and equally as embarrassed Lena. He moved back to stand at my side as she was dropped next to Joffrey and given the last few ribald comments. I caught her eye as the door was closed and tried not to think about how horrified she looked by the whole ordeal. Laner clapped his hand on my shoulder. Don't worry so much about her, she's hardly a stranger to Dash. His mother's meaningful cough cut us off. I think it's time we had a chat. Just us two, don't you? It was with a growing sense of doom that we trailed away from the crowds still shouting their crude phrases and headed towards the Lord Solar. It was hard to tell who was more tense out the three of us, but it was certainly a close-run competition. I turned down her offer of wine when we were finally seated, which she promptly ignored by pushing a goblet into my hands. So, she said, eyes flicking between us as we sat there. I didn't know about Laner, but I felt much like a naughty schoolchild, right now. So, parroted Laner, looking disturbingly cool about the whole business. He was ready to come out of skin though. He'd been waiting for the other shoe to fall with his mother since she'd taken control of the preparations and emerged from her rooms. Now it seemed it was time. I placed my hand on his and he spared me a small smile. I don't understand that. Those little things. Did you practice? She said, nodding to our entwined hands. Not really. It's a gesture of comfort, I replied as Laner stared at our hands as if he'd never given it much thought before. Rhaenys nodded and shifted. We were quiet for some time longer. At a few points she opened her mouth to ask some question or other only to close it once more. You will not have children then? She finally asked in a small voice. I'd never heard her so dismayed. My heart ached. Rhaenyra assures me there are ways around my condition, Laner said, and Rhaenys' eyes came to rest on me. Whilst it was true there were ways, I had never assured him so to my knowledge. Still, I nodded along. And they would be his. My grandchildren in truth? She asked. Yes. No other man involved, I assured her. She nodded to herself before taking a deep and shuddering breath, and I realized this woman who'd faced down a king and his entire court, who in another time would fight 2 dragon riders by herself, was dangerously close to having a complete breakdown. I wasn't sure what to do with that information. I am sorry that I am not the son you wanted, mother, but I will not stand before you and pretend I'm ashamed of myself. I love Joffrey Dash. His voice broke and I wasn't sure who I wanted to comfort more. Rhaenys laughed through her tears suddenly and pulled her son close. Not the son I wanted. You fool. I do not pretend to understand and I do not pretend to approve, but you are my son. I have been so proud of you in these past few days. They both curled close to one another and I felt like an intruder in this family moment. And you, I do not pretend to know how you can put up with this behavior, but I thank you for not telling the world. I jumped as she addressed me before shooting her small smile. It seemed Lena hadn't been wrong about her change in perspective. I thought you too keen to play the helpless baby bird, needing to be rescued. Too keen to let others do your work for you, but I cried a little. I couldn't help it. I am sorry. Everyone was a little weepy after that, although I still avoided the wine. Laner and Rhaenys had no such compunction and each made surprising inroads into a picture as Laner came completely clean with his mother, explaining away her queries and worries. Eventually, with me providing support for a much more wobbly Laner, we reached our rooms and fell into bed. He was smiling so widely, I thought he'd break his face, and I fell asleep listening to him chuckling to himself. The castle was quiet the next morning, with most of its occupants nursing splitting headaches and the other symptoms of a hangover. No one had held back in their drinking, and even I was missing Girardi's cure-alls, no matter how foul they tasted. I stuck with mint tea and bread with an array of fruit preserves to dip it in to settle my troubled stomach. Afterwards I dragged Laner to the practice yard to help me with my archery. Ser Langward would only find new and cruel ways to torture me if I slacked off without him around. Not that Laner was much help, curled up in the corner and cursing the sun, wine and his headache. Joffrey and Lena arrived soon after, arms entwined and looking every inch the happy couple. I took pride in how wide her eyes were as she watched me land arrow after arrow on the target. Still a little haphazard in their placement, but at least I didn't embarrass myself by shooting a passing servant or something as equally ridiculous. We chatted about nonsensical things for a while, each dancing around our own little awkward topic. Joffrey and Laner regarding their still clear love for one another, Lena and Laner regarding the fact she'd slept with the man he loved last night. Joffrey and I due to the promise of my future knowledge, and Lena and I due to the terrible gut-burning guilt that welled up when I thought of how I'd forced her into a marriage she didn't want for a selfish need of her dragon, and how it clashed with the utter rage that she'd slept with the man that had all but maimed me. And now I have the most horrid bruise in the most awkward place. I swear that man is a menace. Lena was telling Laner, who was listening with clear amusement and a little bit of trepidation. Their relationship was shaky, currently, and it would need time for them to return to the easy way they'd had about them before. Back from your thoughts? Joffrey asked quietly. It is nothing, Sir Joffrey, I said, unable to shake the feeling I'd made a terrible mistake. Sea Smoke and Malaise were restless. They were lay about the beach, basking in the midday sun alongside my own Syrax, but I could see signs of their displeasure. It was reassuring in a way. It meant that their riders were all equally as restless and less likely to do something foolish like side with Daemon. Since I'd made it very clear I'd take a dim view of anyone that did so. It was less reassuring that Lena's Vagor was nowhere to be seen. I shifted with anxiety once more. Caraxes had been sighted. I should have foreseen that Corlys would bring Daemon. That Daemon would impulsively gamble his head and kingdom for a better chance at Lena's bed. Corlys had left a large part fleet anchored at Bloodstone by all reports and had taken only his flagship, the Sea Snake, and a small escort back to Driftmark. The ship was his pride and joy, and I could see why. It dwarfed any other ship I'd seen, practically a floating castle of wood and steel. It boasted a reinforced frame and the ability to carry far more soldiers than any mere cog or galley. Anything it didn't immediately smash and sink in a ramming action would soon find itself up against Corlys' finest men, all with top-notch equipment and training. You had to hand it to him. There was a reason Viserys wasn't quite willing to let the idea of him being master of ships go. Never one to arrive without a fanfare, Rhaenys muttered from somewhere to my left. I couldn't bring myself to smile, to wound up, too tense. Next to me, Laenor was much the same. We had decided not to hide the new addition to the family and had simply started out by draping Joffrey in as much teal and silver as we possibly could without him looking too ridiculous. That, combined with the arm thrown around a tense Lena's waist, would hammer home the point far better than any spoken word could. As the ship began docking, Caraxes landed on the beach. The reaction of the other dragons was instant and noticeable. Syrax had begun outright snapping and snarling. Sea Smoke had risen from his prone position, sending a spray of sand across the beach as it dug impossibly deep grooves with his legs. Only Malaise had not moved or reacted much, but I could see the eyes of the Scarlet Dragon trained on the newcomer in warning. As if sensing the danger, Caraxes claimed a stretch of beach much further up and the dragons calmed. I dragged my eyes away from them and refocused on the human arrivals. Corlys was easy to pick out amongst his men. He was the center of the whirlpool of activity, passing down commands in one moment and laughing along with his men the next. I could not see Daemon though. He was the arrogant type. He wouldn't slink off the ship to go hide. He'd flaunt breaking his banishment. He'd want a grand entrance side by side with the Sea Snake in the shadow of Westeros's greatest ship so that all would know he had returned. So where was he? Where is he? Laenor asked, unknowingly echoing my thoughts. Then as if on cue, a tall figure bounded down the gangplank to the cheers of the men below. It was undeniably him. My body stirred with interest and I hated myself. He was beautiful. Not in the way Laenor was. His features were thicker, but Valyrians didn't do ugly, and Daemon was beautiful by our standards too. Just be ready for some kind of trick, I replied. He nodded, pale. He wasn't looking forward to what would come. He might have skirted disobeying his father before, but this was far past rebellion. I rubbed my thumb across the back of his hand and he squeezed mine in return. Next to us Lena was tense in Joffrey's arms, looking deeply unhappy. Joffrey had been upset. He'd wanted more time to poison Lena thoroughly against my uncle. Without that time Lena was in danger of falling right back under his sway. Given the way she was watching the swaggering figure following the Sea Snake, I suspected he had quite the challenge on his hands. Joffrey had told us we must see her as a battleground, each fighting for influence over her. He had the fact she loved him, but we had the promise of a better future for her child and the esteem of her family. He'd told me, made a point of it, that I should be extra nice. No anger. No rejection. I was to be the face of his efforts to win Lena over. I could see the exact moment Corlys saw Joffrey and realized what they had done. He actually stopped. The polite smile fell from his face as he fought with what was clearly rage and frustration. He had moved his daughter about the board like a chess piece, and he was just now realizing that she had, at some point, gotten up and walked off, leaving him in check. His eyes went from his daughter and New Goodson to his son, where they narrowed in accusation. Daemon came to a halt behind him, eyes narrowing as he too realized. His head fell to Dark Sister and I mentally reminded myself where I had my knives and how to retrieve them from the folds of my dress as quickly as possible. Rhaenys was the first to greet them, sweeping forth and pulling her husband into an embrace that I was almost certain included hissed instructions in his ear and the threat of broken ribs because when she pulled away he'd managed to arrange his face into something more polite if a little strained. Something similar occurred with Daemon, although with far less success given he still looked furious as they reached us, hands still tapping the hilt of the legendary blade of Queen Visenya. "Lord Father, welcome home," Laenor said as we stepped forward, giving his father a polite bow which Corlys acknowledged with a stiff nod. "Prince Daemon, welcome to High Tide." Daemon's lips peeled back into a snarl but he returned the greeting after Rhaenys not so subtly elbowed him in the side. Curiously, he cringed away from her. "Laenor, it is good to be home. We have much to discuss." When he spoke his eyes were on Lena and Joffrey again. "However, first I must bring my dear good daughter dire news. Your uncle has been injured in the fighting. I have brought him back here to heal and rest. I would beg your pardon and ask for your support in asking your Lord Father to lift his banishment in this case." "Oh, you smooth bastard. There is no way in hell Viserys would let Daemon heal up on those rocks without a skilled maester with every chance of being killed or dying of infection, and I cannot object without the optics being terrible." So despite wanting to scratch his face off, I smiled sweetly at him. "Of course you have my support in this, Lord Corlys," said through gritted teeth, but said all the same. "I will write to my father with this news. I thank you for your mercy, niece, it is good to see you once more. You and Ser Laenor make quite the beautiful couple." Corlys frowned at that and Daemon seemed to remember himself. I flexed my angry fingers. "Lena, you left so quickly I feared something was wrong," he said, catching her hand lowering his lips to it. I wanted to stab him with his own stupid sword as she blushed. "And now I find you a married woman it seems." "It is, yes. I am sorry you could not be there." Lena stopped flirting with him in front of everyone. Daemon turned a nasty smile to Joffrey, who merely nodded. I mentally went over the downside of stabbing him and running away to ETI with Laenor. Corlys embraced his daughter stiffly, both looking as if they'd rather be hugging an old fish. The rest of the Valerians made their welcomes with bows and curtsies. Most were polite, some genuinely warm, but both his brother's children greeted him with such an icy politeness that he seemed startled by it. Vaemond and Malentine had not held back on telling their families about the bastards, and whilst most in the extended family did not believe it, well, it mattered not now. Adam, Alan and Marilda were safely on Dragonstone and far away from any reprisals. Although I could tell Corlys wanted to head inside to find out just what his son had done, we were forced to observe the niceties. A small meal to celebrate the sea snake's return. That was awkward but navigated well if extremely carefully, with neither side willing to address the elephant in the room. Or rather, the ex-Lonmouth in the room. Even Daemon managed to behave himself for a few hours. His familiar suave manner well in place. Compliments and jests delivered with impeccable timing, a facial expression of outward calm that never bordered on apathy, and always ready with a bawdy tale or two. In fact, the only time he broke the illusion was to fire acidic and borderline insulting comments at Laenor and Joffrey. Oh, but I could see the strain. How his eyes flickered to Lena just a little too much. How his expression tightened every time she turned to address Joffrey. It would also seem he was actually injured, taking a knife during a brawl. Daemon had survived years on that island without any major injuries, and yet losing Lena threw him off enough that he let some random pirate through his guard. I could tell Corlys was very much on edge when Laenor, Lena, Joffrey, Rhaenys, and I finally made it to his solar. He'd sent Daemon away with a whispered and, in some cases hissed, conversation. My uncle had not taken it well, but in the end he'd bowed to Corlys' demands. Clearly Driftmark is an isle of wonders if even my uncle bows to good sense occasionally. He seated himself behind his giant desk and watched us all before slamming a fist into it. Unfortunately for him, his family seemed completely unfazed. Rhaenys and her children looked mutinous. Joffrey had defaulted to his solemn, I'm talking to royalty demeanor, in which he stared at a bit of wall 3 inches left of your face, and I had flinched. Gods damn it. Laenor took my hand. What happened? He asked, obviously struggling not to bellow. I told you to remain on the stepstones whilst I sorted things out with Daemon. Instead you hair off and marry your brother's lover. At that revelation, he watched Laenor with a triumphant gleam in his eye. So Corlys had known, but Rhaenys had not. He looked very disappointed when no one reacted in shock and horror, and instead what he got was his wife cracking him about the face. You knew. Of course I knew. I never told you to spare you the shame, but I knew, he replied after a moment of silence, rubbing his face. His eyes fell on Laner. I trust you told her to get her on board with this disgusting plan to marry your sister to him. Lena told her, Laner said with calm he clearly wasn't feeling as his hand tightened in mine. You do not have the right to anger here, Lord Corlys, you threw your daughter to my uncle with the intention of this happening, I said, coolly. I was determined I wasn't going to be the first to explode, not when the Valerians had more right to anger. She was there to tempt him. She chose to leap into bed with him, he rose to his feet and glared at us. Then I find out you're pregnant, that you shamed yourself and then you shame yourself further by keeping the babe. Damon told me you would ensure we married. Lena shot back, only her mother's hand keeping her from marching over to her father in rage. It seemed her anger at me and her brother might have been transferred from the way she was almost struggling against Rhaenys. You were supposed to be an incentive, a reminder of what he could have. He'd given up on escaping the Royce woman, I needed to secure the stepstones for our future and instead you have married a second son from the Stormlands. I would have made you queen had you restrained yourself for a few months. A queen, father. You married Laner to the queen, she shouted right back. I tried not to feel guilty at her anger. I had decided for her that she wouldn't marry Daemon even though she'd clearly wanted to. How did that make me any better than Corlys? Then my anger crept back because she did want to marry him and how dare she. I wanted to laugh at how twisted up inside this whole business had me. Your mother should have been the queen. You should have been the queen and your brother your king. I was trying to give you a match worthy of you, he sat down heavily and brought his hands up to his face, fight draining from his body. And now even if you had not married Joffrey you would have nothing. Not with that bastard growing in your belly. Not true, Laenor said as Lena recoiled from her father. Corlys looked up at him and then looked at me when Laenor nodded in my direction. You would grant them lands then, he asked me. I will, when I have them to grant. In the meantime I intend to name Lena as one of my ladies, I confirmed. Of course, this is provided you do not do anything to harm Laenor and I's children. Corlys ran his hands over his face and sighed heavily. Then he laughed, an ugly sound full of despair, and leaned back in his chair to face me. In that moment, I was startled to find he truly looked his 60+ years. He looked defeated. And there is the sting in the scorpion's tail. You would have Laenor give Driftmark to your bastards and hold my own daughter's future hostage, he bit out. Laenor snorted in frustration. Do you accept this, my love? Our son will not bed her. As like as not she'll take some man as her lover and pass off his sons as legitimate. Rhaenyra and Laenor have some way of ensuring trueborn children, Rhaenys growled. At least my son would inherit this way. You would have my son robbed of his inheritance. We found Adam and Alan, father. Laenor elaborated, at his look of confusion. You have not. Corlys' face was white with sudden fear, glancing between his wife and son. Rhaenys' face had gone stony, eyes promising retribution for the unfaithfulness. I am no kinslayer. They are safe. Corlys' shoulders slumped at the news. I could not let some faceless knight's children have Driftmark. Not ahead of my own blood. I'd always thought I could marry Lena's children to make sure. Adam and Alan, they were never meant to be anything other than a last resort. He stood up and placed his hands on his son's shoulders. I have only ever wanted the best for you too. Wanted to see you take your rightful places as rulers. Be it of Bravos, Westeros, or the Stepstones. You should have worn crowns. I failed your mother, I did not wish to fail you too. See, now I just felt like a complete idiot. For 3 days we remained on Driftmark with nothing giving in, no outward change. Daemon did his best to play the suave suitor, eager to offer dragon flights and bad poetry from lists that nevertheless had her blushing. He worked to catch her alone, weaved pretty tales of the idea of destined souls and running away together. He was very in love with the idea that he was the only man Lena had ever loved and would ever love. He always had a high opinion of himself. Everyone else worked to pry her from his influence. Every slip of anger on his part became our ammunition and every genuine, sweet thought he had was a strike at our assertion he was a monster. She was caught between her family and the man she loved and nobody had any idea where she would jump. So we all settled into the playing tug-of-war with the rider of the world's largest dragon. I'd never wanted to scream at someone more and been completely unable to. Still, as long as I kept my cool, Joffrey assured me, we would eventually win. Daemon was not a man given to long, thought-out planning. Eventually, he'd mess up and all that was left was to capitalize on that. Provided we played our own parts exactly as he asked. At least Rhaenys and I were allies once more. It almost felt like old times, racing through the air around Driftmark and bitching about Daemon. Well, this time with the added spice of bitching about Lena too. And occasionally Laenor. She was a lot less blind when it came to her children's faults after being so rudely awoken to them. It was Viserys who broke the status quo in the form of a letter informing me that he was coming to visit, having felt guilty that he'd missed my name day feast. It probably had more to do with my letter and Daemon's return, but it was still the first time I'd ever been genuinely happy to see a letter with the king's seal on it. I'd promptly convinced Corlys it was imperative I bring Lena with me to Dragonstone. Although it still took her mother threatening violence to get her to go. Thankfully, my bureaucracy worked in my favor again. They were quick to get everything in the castle up to royal standard. Granted, that was not that hard these days since half of blacks had moved in. Still, it meant a feast at the very minimum, and I couldn't get away with just the normal three-course style. I relished demonstrating it to Laenor, recalling the horrific days when I'd been forced to plan Lena's wedding. Viserys arrived soon after, half his court in attendance on him, with Alicent and my brothers trailing behind. Robert's arrival at Winterfell this was not, despite the crowds that turned out to see their king. Although Viserys was certainly giving Robert a run for his money when it came to his girth. It was sort of depressing really, like the trim and man from my youth had died with his father. I felt Helena's body language change when she spotted her mother and brothers. I was amused to see she was almost quivering with excitement. I placed a hand on her shoulder, hopefully she knew not to dart out at them before ceremony had been observed, but she was young and unused to being away from her mother. For all that she was mature for her age, she was still only 6. We bowed low as Viserys and Alicent approached, and I was glad that my ladies had taken to tutoring her in etiquette, as her bow was much improved. The queen was not looking at me at all, her eyes were on her only daughter as if searching for unreported injuries or some kind of harm. Aegon and Aemond were acting like two children who'd just been on a reasonably long journey and were then having to stay still and be polite. That is to say, they weren't behaving all that well. It was Daeron that made my eyes nearly pop out my head. He wasn't a pink bean anymore. He was still being held by a nursemaid, but he looked to be doing a good job at squirming free. Could a 1-year-old even walk? Oh well, maybe I could get some bonding time in with him. He might not remember later down the line, but it was never too late to start trying to PR your way past the whole mother knows best thing Alicent had going on. Welcome to Dragonstone, your graces, the castle is yours, I said, as we stood. Viserys studied me, face solemn in a way I couldn't quite figure out. I borrowed Joffrey's tactic of staring just past the royal earlobe and adopted a blank face in defense. Then a large smile broke out over his features and pulled me into a hug that drove the air from my lungs. He did the same for Laenor, leaving him staggering, and then scooped up Helena, swinging her around as she laughed in delight. In the corner of my eye, Alicent's face softened a little now that she could see Helena seemed well. My queen. I bowed slightly as she approached. Fun fact, I had to bow to her if Viserys was around. Something she liked to take advantage of. That being said, if dear old dad was nowhere to be seen, she had to bow to me. Funnily enough, we didn't speak much on days Viserys wasn't by her side. Princess, she murmured in acknowledgement as Laenor and the rest bowed in greeting. You have my thanks for watching over my daughter so diligently. Helena is a sweet girl, I told her, maintaining my best civil tone. My brothers look well. Daeron has grown so much. Alicent turned to regard them just as Aemond thumped Aegon in the back of the head. I covered my laugh up with a cough. The two boys glanced up and caught our gaze. Aemond flushed in embarrassment, but his brother paled as our eyes met. Poor kid. They are well. Daeron is every inch the rambunctious child his brothers were, Alicent told me as she turned back, favoring me with a gracious smile and putting extra stress on the word brothers. I had to hand it to her, this woman was a top-notch actress. Viserys joined our little smiling competition a moment later, handing the still giggling Helena to her mother. Alicent held her close, which got a more genuine smile out of me. She did love her children. That was her biggest strength and biggest weakness. I was hoping you could show your old man the changes you've made to the place, he boomed. Every heir makes their own changes, I'm eager to see yours. I would be glad to, father, I replied. There was no easy way out of playing tour guide to the king. He beamed and then gestured Aegon over. Realizing his father's intention, Aegon's gait was a little wobbly and he went from pale to white. I really want to know what Alicent told the kid. And then I really want to slap Alicent. Still, my love for bureaucracy smoothed over any awkwardness I might have felt. When I'd come to Dragonstone, the castle had been neglected in the extreme. Eamon, Balon, and even Viserys had bound themselves to the capital, and Dragonstone had suffered for it. There was no real, clear centralized administration. The castellan looked after the castle proper, the steward was in charge of finances, there was a reeve appointed to look after the castle town and deal with the villages elsewhere on Dragonstone, a bailiff to collect taxes and dues, a marshal to overlook its defenses, and a master-at-arms who oversaw the guard and their training. Each masters of their own spheres of overlapping influence, each fighting for power over the island, each fighting for command of lesser posts, and each a seemingly endless font of frustration, idiocy, and inefficiency. Take the charcoal incident. When my experiments had first started, I'd needed charcoal. I'd had to speak to the castellan to discover we had none and subsequently order it. Then I had to speak to the steward to release funds. Then I had to speak with the bailiff to find out why he hadn't handed over that month's gold. Then I'd had to organize a guard for the transport because the bailiff and master of arms had been having a fight over patrols. Patrols the marshal was responsible for but had bunked off to go drinking, letting petty crime and tavern brawls get out of hand. Then I'd had to hire men from the town through the reeve because the castellan didn't have men to spare and in fact was unsure how many men he even employed because no one wanted to tell him the truth. You get the idea. So I'd been forced to switch things up, if only to make life, and my experiments, easier. The castellan, I explained to Viserys, was now the ultimate power on Dragonstone unless I said otherwise. He oversaw the rest, who'd each had their duties significantly trimmed. The bailiff now served under the steward, the master of arms had been merged with the marshal, and the reeve now served as my representative outside the castle rather than a power in his own right. Other, lesser, roles had been assigned under the area they made most sense to. Chamberlain under castellan, harbor master under reeve, and so on. Then as punishment for their past idiocy I introduced them to the idea of reports and paperwork. Not that I mentioned it was a punishment to Viserys. No, making them sign forms in triplicate and unleashing archiving on them was all about accountability. So I could double-check they weren't stealing from me or using their positions to abuse their power. Watching them grimace and get wrist cramps was just a bonus. Honest. I would never be so petty. I'd set up a pseudo-HR department for maximum nastiness and promptly discovered staffing was terrifying. Did you know that until I'd arrived the Dragonstone kitchens hired anyone who turned up with a ladle? No references, just show up early enough with the rest of a pool of transient, unskilled workers and you're in. And this same pool of potential staff members fed every other area of menial work? Because I didn't. How poison hasn't played a bigger role in Westerosi politics I will never know. Regardless, my HR department kept track of references, training, who was in charge of who and when to cut certain grab-happy grooms loose for chasing the kitchen maids a little too intently. Everyone gets paid on time, everyone knows what they're doing, everyone is probably not an assassin waiting to poison me, and with the basic hygiene training for everyone involved in any kind of cleaning or cooking meant they probably wouldn't accidentally poison me either. I'm impressed. I'd never looked into things this deeply before. Viserys said as I finished my explanation. He had a look on his face that said someone in the capital might be learning the joys of human resources very soon. Aegon, clearly, had not been so thrilled by my long lecture of command structure, administration, and recruitment because he looked ready to fall asleep on his feet. Then again he was 8, so what did you expect? And you can just throw a feast out of nowhere instead of racing around doing it half by hand now? He asked, stroking his stupid mustache. Who told him that looked good? Was it Alicent? I bet it was Alicent. And ensure most complaints are heard without me having to hear them directly, I replied, and he brightened up considerably at that. Since it's probably Lionel that's going to get this dropped on his desk, I should probably draw up a letter of apology now. Well, isn't that a thing? Hear that, Aegon? Your sister has the right of it. Less complaints and more feasts, I say. Aegon jerked out of his half-doze and nodded along frantically as if a proper complaints procedure were his heart's most fervent desire. Viserys patted him on the back. I have half a mind to give Aegon to that husband of yours. I know he has the Rosby lad, but a page won't hurt and it gets Aegon out of the court where they'll stop feeding him so much tripe. Aegon froze. Any boredom he had was gone now. Slowly, he turned a trembling head towards me as if I were some kind of T-Rex and any speedy movement would cause me to notice his presence and eat him. My own smile became rather strained too. Having Aegon alongside Helena would be a coup for me, yes, but the boy really was terrified of me. It seemed cruel. Also Alicent would probably bathe me in wildfire. I doubt Alicent would like that. Besides he is doing so well with Kristen. Viserys snorted in derision when I mentioned his Lord Commander. He could do with getting out of his mother's skirts, he groused. Father, he is 8. Allow him as much time as possible with his mother, one can never predict if something will happen after all. Viserys' face softened at that. Well, you may have a point there, he admitted, likely remembering I was not much younger than Aegon when Emma had died. Aegon was glancing between us with a small ray of hope blossoming on his face. Viserys dropped a hand to his shoulder and shoved him forward towards me. Well, at least take the boy until the feast tonight. You barely have time together as it is, siblings should be closer. And then he was off. Seriously, whatever he smoked I wanted. Maybe it was the Hippocras. How is the capital? I asked, as Viserys disappeared round the corner. Good, Aegon squeaked back. How's Aemond and Daeron? Good. Otto? Good. Kristen? Good. Oh, for Seven's sake. I cried and the boy flinched. I swallowed my annoyance heavily, stamped out the frustration with him and reminded myself he was just a child. You know I will not eat you, Aegon. I am fond of you all, I am your big sister. When he said nothing I sighed again. At least believe that no man or woman is more accursed than a kinslayer. I would not harm you because the gods themselves will not allow it. Shockingly, theology was not reassuring to an 8-year-old, so I stashed him in my solar with paper and permission to draw whatever he felt like, and in order to tell Viserys he'd spent a splendid afternoon with me. He'd agreed readily and left me to my reports, although I wasn't foolish enough to not keep an eye on him between the carefully doctored tales my employees like to tell me of their rivals' incompetence. He seemed to be trying to draw a knight of some description, a knight fighting something. Oh, very funny, you little shit. It was a knight fighting a dragon that I was fairly certain was supposed to be me. Actually, he wasn't half bad at art. Even if he did gouge the veneer off of the desk that had been in this solar since before Aegon the Conqueror's time. After I'd finished signing off on a couple of reports, I praised his excellent shading, critiqued his subject matter and sent him packing with orders for him to be cleaned before the feast. I pinned the drawing to the wall. It would do wonders to remind me that for all the trouble he caused me, it was indirect and he was a child at Alicent's mercy. I decided to do something new for the feast tonight. Instead of my normal veil style, I went for something in a reach cut. Bare shoulders, rich fabrics. Hopefully it wouldn't be seen as a slight against Alicent, but I had to admit the reach style did sexy very well and I wanted to feel good tonight. No, Lady Lena. Lace it this way, you won't lose a hand if you touch her. No. Like this. A tug brought me back to reality and I sighed. I'd named Lena a lady and all I could say is that I was glad Maris had not yet arrived back from the Vale yet, because the Grafton would have crucified the poor girl. Not she wasn't making it completely obvious to anyone she'd rather not be here, so maybe her and Maris could get along splendidly. Shared circumstances and all that. Maria was trying her hardest to make up for her, but, well. Another clumsy yank illustrated my point nicely and I heard Felena sigh in something dangerously close to despair. Ahead of me the twins were already dressed for the feast, having been excused their duties tonight. Technically speaking, so had Felena, but she'd dived in anyway. Felena was not one to sit back and complain about something if she could dive and get her hands dirty. Metaphorically speaking, of course, I do pride myself on cleanliness above and beyond that expected by most Westerosi, which is by itself surprisingly clean. Somehow, we were all ready in time for the feast. Even if Lena looked incredibly uncomfortable in her gown of Valerian teal and silver. The feast went well enough. The greens that had managed to sneak aboard with Viserys' party were making themselves inconspicuous and my usual assortment of nobles were too busy sucking up to the king to be bothering me. It seemed Viserys had not forgotten about his hate boner for the greens, because there were so little present that one would assume Alicent hadn't even tried to bring back up. Any green who I could easily identify seemed very keen on avoiding the king's gaze, as if they were expecting him to stroke out at the mere sight of them. Alicent herself barely made any acidic comments. She asked about Helena's education, she managed a few about pregnancy after asking after news of that, but that was tame. Completely and utterly tame. Had Viserys put his foot down or something? It was well into the dancing when the man who called himself my father laid a hand on my shoulder and bent down to request my presence in the solar. He was outright swaying as we made our way up. Ser Fel had to place a hand on his back several times to prevent him from toppling over. When we finally got there, Viserys ordered yet more wine and told Ser Fel to remain outside on guard. He strode inside as if he were still Lord of Dragonstone and sat his growing bulk into the chair behind the desk. He waited until we were served and he had a full goblet in his hand to start talking. Well done with the Valerian business. You saved me from an awkward position there. Oh no, is he trying to have a friendly and fatherly conversation with me? Where has this come from? Well, Lena is a friend, I said. Well, she probably wasn't now, but I couldn't exactly point out it was her dragon I wanted. I downed my own wine and grabbed some more. If he was going to try and be friendly, I needed to be drunk. Yes. She seems a fine girl. Nearly married her, he told me, voice slurring. Ugh, I'd forgotten about that. Various members of the court after my mother died had been agitating for Viserys to marry Lena to unite the two competing claims for the throne. Honestly, I prefer Alicent. If Viserys had named me heir with Rhaenys about, Malaise would have eaten me years ago. You seem quite taken with Ser Laenor. He is a good man. I enjoy his company. Please let this end soon. Please let him get bored. I'd even take a screaming match over whatever this is. Did he read a parenting guide and decide to connect with the youth or something? I mean, he has never done anything like this before. Not even when I was made his cupbearer and I spent my days trailing after him making a how not to be ruler guide based on his actions. But you and he are fond of each other. There was almost a desperate note in his voice and I forced myself to mentally check into the conversation again to properly study him. Are you asking if we love one another? I asked carefully. He poured more wine. Maybe not love, something more than just tolerating one another. That is not something a Westerosi would normally ask. Or even care about. We are friends. He is a good and kind man, I reassured him and he nodded and took a few more gulps from the goblet. Is something wrong? No. No, nothing is wrong. Not with me. We sat in silence for a few more minutes as he finished off the pitcher. I wasn't sure what to say. I was so sure that seeing him again after my flight from King's Landing would fill me with rage, and it did, but also a lot of confusion. We did not part on the best of terms. That startled a disbelieving laugh from me before I clamped down on it. The look he gave me was tired rather than angry. I deserve that. And there goes the confusion. I took a few deep breaths. Last time I'd fucked a salvageable situation by flipping out and trying to hurt him as much as he was hurting me. Joffrey had made it clear I had to stop doing that. That I had to get serious and I couldn't indulge in childish tantrums over hurt feelings anymore. It was still so hard. It was still rude of me. I apologize, I said. He chuckled in response and then called for another pitcher of wine that was delivered so fast they might have been waiting outside with it. I'd made it clear this visit needed to be perfect and it appeared my staff had delivered. Your letter said Daemon was back. How badly is he injured? His tone was odd and hard to parse. Genuine worry, frustration and something else I couldn't place. He will be well enough in a few weeks. Then he can return to the Stepstones. Viserys stared at me uncomprehendingly. I elaborated slowly, like I was talking to a child. Because he is technically breaking his banishment. The one you gave him for breaking my fingers and drawing steel on me. I remember what I banished him for. I'll leave it up to you to decide when he's well enough to leave. It seems appropriate, he replied dryly. I took a sip of wine to cover up my surprise. Viserys was normally very forgiving when it came to Daemon. Don't give me that look. I've not been the best brother to Daemon, but he went too far when he hurt you. I should have listened to you, but I convinced myself it was just another black and green battleground. We were both agreeing that he was out of line, I pointed out sourly. Viserys didn't seem to notice my tone as he nodded. More awkward silence, more Viserys drinking wine like it was going out of fashion. That business in the Vale. I meant what I said in my letter. It was well done. Emma would have been proud of you. I swallowed thickly at that. He was playing dirty by bringing her into it. She used to dote on Jane, tried to have me bring the girl to King's Landing. Her regent refused. Ybert sounds like something of a cunt, I muttered without meaning to. Viserys roared with sudden laughter that made me jump. Ha! You never met the man, but you'd be right, he chuckled, tossing back more wine. How was he not passed out right now? Surely his bulk couldn't soak up that much. Do you know why I married your mother? He asked suddenly. I shook my head, bemused by the sudden change in topic. It was right after Uncle Eamon's death. Ah. This is about Rhaenys. He nodded, closing his eyes. It killed father to see her turn on him like that. Disappeared off to Driftmark with Jocelyn and the new babe and refused to see him. From her point of view, he turned on her first, I pointed out. I'd never actually asked Rhaenys about what had happened. It seemed too much like rubbing salt in the wounds. I suppose you could look at it that way. It still hurt him. He didn't want to be heir before her. Jaehaerys made him. Said even if she weren't a woman, a tried and tested warrior was better than a stripling youth of 17. You reminded me of him when Aegon was born. Did I? I asked. Viserys snorted. I had made cautious mention of maybe changing his heir, as much as it truly pained me to do so. Viserys had turned me down cold. I married your mother because father needed the support. The Stormlands were acting up. Rhaenys had Corlys, his fleet and his blood. Jaehaerys wanted to make sure my heirs would have dragon blood on both sides and a Lord Paramount to back their claims. We didn't much like each other in the beginning. She was 11. And that still creeps me out. Yes, she was. 11 and quiet as Dormouse. Did her duty though. Daemon mocked me for days. Was that bitterness when you said Daemon's name? I think it was. I should have been a second son. I could have lived with being a second son. Daemon would have been a worthy first. The only reason I claimed Balerion is because he mocked my lack of dragon. As if he were the expert. He took Uncle Aemon's Caraxes the year before you see and you know when Rhaenys took Malaise. He found it quite funny I lacked a dragon. That did sound like Uncle Daemon. Arrogant, cruel, and convinced he was the warrior reborn. Then Emma had Aemon and I could look my brother in the eyes and feel worthy of being born first. Aemon. Viserys blinked at me, looking decidedly more drunk now than he had a few minutes ago. I could make a guess as to his identity but... Your brother. Older brother. Did Emma truly never make a mention of him? I knew I had an older brother who'd died in the cradle but I'd never heard his name. Mentions of him caused Mother's face to crease in pain, Prince Balon to look sad and make a small prayer to the Seven and Viserys. Well, I'd never heard him mention to Viserys. I'd certainly never gotten a name. Well, we named him after Uncle Aemon. Lived for all of 6 moons. Balerion died soon after. Ouch. Losing your firstborn son and your dragon in the same time frame. Ouch. Wait, help, I'm feeling sympathy for Viserys of all people. Forgive me father, I do not see dash. Lena reminded me of her, he said, cutting me off and meeting my eyes. Of your mother. A small child being asked to marry a man much older than her. I remember sitting on that throne and realizing I couldn't do it. Rhaenys brought her in all dressed up and paraded her in front of everyone. She looked up at me and I couldn't. I remember that. I wasn't lying. I do remember. It had been only a few months after Viserys had made me his cupbearer. Lena had been terrified, that much was obvious. Rhaenys had tried to pass it off as nerves. Lena had been 12 and small. Viserys had been 28 and already fat. I could understand her terror. I was king. So I married someone I loved and I sent her back to Driftmark. And like a coward I sold you to the Valerians to do my duty. He stood suddenly and swayed on unsteady feet. His violet eyes peered down at me and I realized he was close to crying. He drew me to my feet and pulled me into his arms before taking a great shuddering breath. I found his hug to be very tight. My ribs protested and I struggled to stay steady as he swayed back and forth, his strength forcing me to follow him. I hurt you. You do not know how sorry I am. Come back to court with me. Bring Ser Laner, hell bring your entire court but come back. I should not have sent you away. I know that now. He let me loose from the bone-crushing pressure and clapped me on the shoulders. He was a messy crier, I noted idly, despite my surprise. His face was a blotchy red and tears had drenched his now almost invisible mustache. He moved his hands to cradle my face. Come home. Come help me rule. Well, that's one way of getting unbanished. If you like this content, don't forget to like and subscribe. See you later, bye bye.